Julie Parle is presently a research associate at the University of Pretoria, having previously been affiliated with the University of KwaZulu-Natal. Her research has focused on the social histories of mental health, medicine, and pharmaceutics in South Africa. And we will be in conversation with her today about her past, present, and future lives as a historian of South Africa. Welcome, Julie.
Hi, Thula. Hi, Lindie. Good to see you.
Okay, well, please tell us about your background, what in it kindled your love of history as a subject, and then get us to the start of what brought you to the University of Natal.
Right. I was born in England in August 1962, the eldest child of a dentist and a school teacher. My parents were both raised by single mothers. My maternal grandmother was apprenticed to a tailor by the age of 14. Naively understanding nothing about, or next to nothing about South Africa's history or politics, my parents emigrated to South Africa to about 30 kilometers outside Durban in 1974. I was one of at least 10,000 children born affected by the drug thalidomide in the womb. Very many died at birth, some were left to die, and we know that some thalidomide-affected babies were killed. I mention this for two reasons in our conversation about what influenced me to become a historian. First, as a family, we could not help but be aware that we were unwittingly part of something big. Thalidomide was called the greatest drug scandal of all time. Although I only came to study it much later in life, and after a lot of persuasion from other historians, after 1962, pharmaceutical drug testing protocols were made compulsory in most countries. Abortion laws were changed, including here in South Africa, where officially at least no so-called thalidomide babies had been born. But between 1962, my birth, and about 20 years ago, I put a lot of effort into believing that this was irrelevant to me and my work. Secondly, thalidomide shaped my education. The school in England and then in Durban that I attended after age 11 were so-called special schools. Another term would be segregated. In England, a good friend, closest to me in the ways that the drug had affected us, was a black Trinidadian-born thalidomide. We joke to this day that people will think we are twins. There were resources for developing independence. Academic standards were good. In Durban, I went to a whites-only Christian nationalist education, weekly boarding school, where I was immediately ostracized for not speaking Afrikaans. Practical independence was not a high priority, but there were many black staff to assist, and I had no choice in the subjects that I had to take. Those were chosen for us, and for the best, the life administrator or a bookkeeper. The relief subjects for me were English and history, and these are what I chose to take at university in my first year in 1980. I was, I think, among the first matriculant from that school to go to university full-time on campus. I left school with enormous relief, but with little idea of what sort of a future I would be able to make. I had always read a lot of historical fiction and detective novels. Both have influenced me more than you would think. I read about class oppression in Winston Graham long before I did in Marx. I read about the need to think critically about your sources in Josephine Tay before I did in Anne Laura Stoller. Race and relative accessibility dictated which university campus I could study and live on. So it was Pietermaritzburg rather than Durban. It also determined the lecture and the tutorial rooms I could physically enter, and thus the subjects I could study. And then later, the archives I could and can work in. I took courses in English, politics, economic history, and classics. ultimately deciding to go on to history honours. At first, that was without the encouragement of the then head of department, who repeatedly warned me and my peers that we would never get a full-time job at the University of Natal. He was also not slow to point out my limitations as a graduate student. Our honours year gave me a grounding in historiography with bite-sized chunks of Marx, E.P. Thompson, cliometrics, and most appealing to me, the annals and their attention to social and total history. It's stunning to think now that reading Marx was banned, except for limited academic purposes. The Freedom Charter was banned, and so was the ANC, the PAC, SASO, the BPC, and so on. The 1980s were the years of the states of emergency, boycotts, the UDF, the End Conscription Campaign, the Black Sash, and numerous organizations inspired by liberation theology. There were silent protests, academic processions, and spies on campus. My honours thesis was supervised by the only woman member of the then joined History and Economic History departments, Ruth Edgecombe. No one ever accused Ruth of being an easygoing person, but she was often generous, passionate, and an inspired lecturer. She died young, only 57, in early 2001, an early champion of environmental history in South Africa. It's often forgotten today. With no prospects of a career, I started an MA researching an economic history topic with 19th century primary sources I could access at the Maritzburg archives. It was a kind of trick question as an undergraduate. Who was right, the liberals or the radicals? Did you need to give priority to race or to class? The answer, of course, was both. I wanted to research a time before the Mineral Revolution. I wanted to research race and class and gender. My naive ambition was to write a sort of total history of Pietermaritzburg during a short period of economic depression in the mid-1860s. I tried to account for the experiences of women and men, African, white, and indentured and free Indian. It took me 4.5 years to finish the MA. The outcome in 1988 was a theoretically anemic 200-plus page thesis. But I had fallen in love with the process of slow, painstaking research, learning how the colonial archive fitted together, seeing where the sources took me without trying to predetermine where that might be. For better or worse, that has been pretty much my hallmark of my method of research ever since. I was a good tutor, marker, and eventually leave substitute lecturer. So for more than 10 years, that's what I did. The department in Maritzburg was then probably at its height personnel-wise. The number of Black students was growing, some drawn to history for its relevance to contemporary politics, others, though I think less so at the time, for validation of ethnic identities. A funded post was opened for a lecturer to support students academically. There were intense discussions about how the curriculum should be reformed. How could underprepared students best be supported? I taught many first-year classes in politics, history, and especially economic history. The latter was a 2-year major, much embraced by rugby players, teachers looking for a university qualification, and economics students in need of a filler major. We taught big history, to which Africa was connected but not integral. Then, after Ruth's sudden and untimely death in early 2001, I was appointed the course developer and co-presenter for Africa in the World, from Naissance to Renaissance, literally from the Big Bang to the African Renaissance, a year-long bridging course in the School of Humanities and Social Sciences, which had the discipline of history as its anchor. Ruth had conceptualized the course. The problem is she hadn't got around to putting anything on paper. It was externally funded. Looking back, it's a very controversial course. In fact, it was controversial at the time for some of the reasons that have attached themselves to the kind of liberal thinking of Mabel Palmer and separate education, even though it was not racially determined who could attend the course. It was overwhelmingly attended by underprepared Black students who couldn't yet quite qualify for the university entrance. And there was some anger at the course. It was also controversial amongst other lecturers and amongst students for insisting on teaching the history of human evolution and the basics of science. By the late 1990s, it was clear that humanities students needed to understand the basics of the science of HIV. AIDS was stigmatized, a taboo topic, but it was clearly beginning to cut a deadly swathe through the number of young students who were sitting in front of us. I don't think we have quite appreciated how many were lost to university scholarship and development in the 1990s and the early 2000s to HIV/AIDS.
And then, Julie, you started working on colonialism and women's history, which led to your entry into the dynamic subfields of histories of health. Why the shift, and what, if any, is the relation between histories of health and social or radical historiography?
Okay, so I was disenchanted with event-driven history. In the early 1990s, I was drawn to the then growing field of women's history. In the 1980s, there was very little to no contact at my level as a part-time contract employee with anyone in the history or economic history departments in university in Durban. It's strange today to remember how much more independent of each other the University of Natal, Pietermaritzburg, and Durban was, let alone the University of Westville. This was before the internet was freely available to us in precarious part-time positions in Pietermaritzburg. The mid to late 1990s saw great changes at the University of Natal. Increased student numbers, increased managerialism, the corporate university, new courses and directions. In 1991, I got a lift 2 days in a row to the groundbreaking Women and Gender in Southern Africa conference in Durban. It was my first real exposure to heated, passionate, and sometimes volatile debates and divisions in academia between feminists about race, class, activism, representation, and the politics of scholarship and practice. I was already tentatively exploring registering for a PhD at 2 other universities, thinking to research women in colonial Natal, an extension of my work in the 19th century. This conference and the publications that followed underscored how unprepared I was for meaningful engagement with the topic. I read Cheryl Walker's seminal Women and Gender in Southern Africa to 1945, which was a lodestar book. I taught a module on women and gender in history in Pietermaritzburg in 1995. I didn't have a supervisor, but I did want to write and say something. So I wrote a conference paper based on a settler woman, Louisa McLeod, who had been somewhat valorized in conventional accounts of white women in colonial Natal. My take was to look critically at how she and similarly initially impoverished settler women had contributed to the household economy, as well as to how class and settler identities began to solidify over time. I presented the paper at my first South African, as it was called then, South African Historical Society conference at Rhodes in 1995. I traveled there with Ruth Edgecombe. I witnessed Helen Bradford's electrifying presentation of what would be published as Women, Gender and Colonialism, Rethinking the History of the British Cape Colony and its Frontier Zones, 1806 to 1870, subsequently published in the Journal of African History. Still one of the most arresting contributions to historical scholarship that I have encountered. And at the same conference, I met Catherine Burns. She was presenting a paper on another Louisa Mvembe. To my enormous surprise, the SAHS, the South African Historical Society, invited me to publish the paper in the South African Historical Journal. I didn't know what to do next. In the late 1990s, greater contact between Durban campuses and Pietermaritzburg and UDW was facilitated through gender studies, with meetings and reading groups involving Kath, Cheryl Walker, Cheryl Della Rey, Rob Morell, and others. When I could, I attended the History and African Studies seminar in Durban, which exposed me to critical engagement to debates then current about postmodernism and historical methodologies. At that time, I was reading feminist historians on the medicalization of women's health, and particularly on the apparently large-scale confinement of women in mental asylums. In the mid-1990s, a bunch of different strands of theory and historiography, gender, Foucault, anti-psychiatry, histories of protest and madness, aligned to suggest to me that a place I drove past every day, the former Natal Government Lunatic Asylum, which is still known as Town Hill Hospital, would be an interesting place to research. I decided to ask Catherine Burns to take me on as a PhD student. Happily, she agreed. I think that was 1998. At the end of 2001, I was gobsmacked to be invited to apply for a post in the history department in Durban as a member of staff. Not that I was their first choice. At least one previous applicant had stood them up for a post, I believe, in the USA. On the Howard College campus of what became UKZN in 2004, I taught modules in gender, health and healing in Africa, world history to the 16th century to first years, and a module, epidemics and social change and historical perspective at honors level. I have a feeling this was thought a little niche at the time, but I offer you COVID-19 as an example of its relevance. The final seminar of the semester was titled The Coming Plagues. By looking at history and societies through a select number of epidemic diseases, the Black Death, the Spanish flu, pandemic AIDS, TB, the cattle lung disease, the rinderpest, cholera, and social plagues, so forth and so on, we read a range of historians from differing theoretical and methodological standpoints, too many to name here. But to briefly respond to your question about health and social and radical historiography, let's touch on the works of Schuyler Marx. Known to most as a radical historian, her published works cross many historiographical realms. In the 1980s, at the same time as working on class and nationalism, she wrote on apartheid and the structural causes of ill health in South Africa. She wrote for the WHO. In the 1990s, she wrote on colonialism and disease, and on race, gender, and nursing. And she wrote on colonial psychiatry. Later, she published on minor silicosis and compensation, and on the historical, structural roots of AIDS in Southern Africa. And she also wrote a little-known but fine Foucauldian-inspired analysis of the staff of a mental hospital, again with attention to race, class, gender, and ethnicity. More recent medical historians have tackled histories of birth, of abortion, of reproductive health and sexuality, the publics of healthcare and resistance to the post-apartheid state, and critiques of international pharmaceutical capitalism. Others have analyzed the medical education and the intersection of anti-apartheid politics and Black consciousness. Many of us feel that this is activist research, demonstrating the importance of historical understandings of past and present. Actually, how can you really tell South Africa's past or present without understanding them?
Okay, so you got your PhD in 2004 and you published States of Mind Searching for Mental Health in Natal and Zululand from 1868 to 1918, 3 years later. What are your memories of the both processes and what were the key findings of your research? So the writing process and ups and downs, highlights, lowlights, getting a publisher, all of those aspects, getting to completion of both those projects.
Well, the publishing part was, if memory serves correctly, quite easy. Jeff Guy, my head of department in Durban, was a member of the UKZN press board, and he suggested to them that my thesis was publishable. They read it, they agreed, and they assigned me a talented and wise editor, a retired emeritus professor of English, Margaret Lenter. UKZN produced a beautiful book. An agreement to co-publish with an American academic press fell through at the last minute, I regret to say. I think that this was partly because the thesis and the book did not fit in with the then, perhaps still, zeitgeist for academic studies of colonial psychiatry, which were anchored in the view that the profession and the institutions in which it was based, i.e. mental asylums, were powerful exercises in state control. Salter Bow's book on the history of scientific racism had been published in 1995. Harriet Deacon, Shuler Marks, and Sally Schwartz were writing really inspired analyses of race and psychiatric power in the Cape, but nothing had been done on KZN. As I mentioned then, called the Natal Government Lunatic Asylum, now still functioning as Town Hall Psychiatric Hospital. This was the first custom-built, purpose-built psychiatric hospital. I'm stuck in the mindset of the 19th century for a moment. Purpose-built psychiatric hospital in Southern Africa. Their work shaped my early thinking and my initial hypotheses. I intended to show that psychiatry in Natal in the colonial period operated to control women and Black dissidents. In fact, I ended up arguing something different, that colonial psychiatrists and asylums, at least in KZN at the time period before the First World War, had very limited impact. Like others, I found that yes, the Natal Government Asylum had been a place of confinement, and yes, it was a racist institution, and no, it was not always a benign experience to be a patient, far from it. But also what became very clear from the archives is that families, including Black families, were increasingly playing an active and decisive role in initiating the committal of patients. I found that more people were listed in the censuses as, quote, insane, as being outside of the asylum than were in it. I also found that the asylum was not a totally closed institution. Patients could sometimes be discharged, in at least one dramatic case, disastrously, murderously. So the main parts of the thesis, which became the book, are about how ordinary people, not doctors, not scientists, but ordinary people, African, Indian, and settler, and their families try to find a remedy or an ease for mental distress and desperation, including by suicide. I attempted to be attentive to the experiences of some Black women who had not left any written trace. One way was through archival records of a court case about groups of women who called themselves the Amandiki. The court could not decide if they were mad or victims of hysteria or not. In their view, the Amandiki, they had been bewitched. Feminist writings on hysteria offered me, it seemed, a way into historicizing witchcraft and spirit possession in KwaZulu-Natal in the colonial period. I used this lens again in a later article co-authored with anthropologist Fiona Scorgi on Umkhayiso, a young among young women. Indigenous or traditional medicine has a different ontology to biomedicine, but I wanted to show that it too has histories. Ufufoniani, Umkhaiso, Indiki. Historical records clearly show that all had changed over time. How and why were questions that seemed important to me. I wanted not to speak for women, but to hear them. Nonetheless, I found that the asylum was a last resort, not the first place that people were hustled into. I stand by that research and those arguments, even though it seems to me that most of the people who cite me have selectively read only the chapters on the asylum itself. Some of my readers who've read the whole book have recognized my arguments and see that they align with a stronger strand in social history than with Foucauldian or state-down analyses. One controversial decision I made, which I wrote about later in an article published in the journal in Italian Zulu history, and which is now often used for teaching, I'm told, was to use the full names of the people I wrote about. This, I believe, and I argue, helps challenge stigma about mental illness, both in the past and now. It has led to some people, black and white, contacting me to look for the records of their family members who were committed as psychiatric patients in KwaZulu-Natal. I like writing accessible, hopefully useful history responsible to the place in which it happened.
And then, Julie, you were the co-researcher and project coordinator alongside Kathy Burns and Vanessa Noble of the Health Pioneers in South Africa project from 2005. And the focus was on McCord Zulu Hospital in Durban. So what is the importance of this institution?
The Health Pioneers project started out as an ambitiously, widely cast NRF-funded project, which had intellectual overlap with a similar project about Christian missions, black schools and education in KZN, which was helmed by Vugile Kumalo, now head of KwaZulu-Natal Archives. A little later, we roped in Vanessa Noble, who was finishing up working on her PhD, and then book on Black medical education and anti-apartheid politics at the now Nelson Mandela Medical School, UKZN. It was a way of getting a little financial support for teams of postgraduate students, and some of them developed their entries into the Health Pioneers project into honors and master's dissertations. Around that time, Kath was approached by the then head medical superintendent and CEO of McCord Hospital to write a book about the hospital's history in time for its centenary celebrations in 2011. It proved to be practically and intellectually a way to bring the research into a manageable format. At first, we envisaged a single volume which would span the time from the late 1890s through to 2011. Then Catherine left UKZN at the end of 2009 for a very busy career in the academic activist healthcare sector. And it wasn't possible to work together as we had before. Also, shortly afterwards, a historian's dream happened. McCord Hospital, during refurbishment, found a large suitcase full of amazing primary documents, which had to be read, they had to be treated for black mold, they had to be sorted, they had to be archived. That slowed us down. It took quite a while. But the material greatly expanded what we could say that was new to the histories of nursing, medicine, and politics in KwaZulu-Natal and South Africa. We had so much material, and given that Vanessa and I were both in KwaZulu-Natal, this was pre-Zoom days, we decided that a first book covering the 1890s to the 1970s, at which time a decision had actually been made to close the hospital, should appear sooner rather than later. It did in 2017. In the meanwhile, I had returned to the Maritzburg campus, and McCord Hospital ended its life as a semi-private institution to become a government specialist eye hospital. I'm delighted to let you know that Kath is one of the authors of a new team, which has completed a second volume of McCord's history, which covers the 1990s to the 2010s, coming out soon with Jacana. As to its significance, to trim a long story, at the same time that we were writing the McCord book, there were similar projects happening on Groote Schuur and Baragwana, and a suite of hospitals across the African country. We realized that what made McCord different was that in the colonial period, it dated from the colonial period, and it had played a determined role in fostering education for Black nurses and doctors. And this had implications for the class history of KwaZulu-Natal and nationally for seeding generations of Black doctors and nurses. We argued that so-called Western medicine was not merely imposed on Black South Africans, instead that they helped to shape it across time. McCord's was also unusual in being a mission hospital, a Christian mission hospital, in an urban area, which was specifically identified by Furwood for removal under the Group Areas Act. We traced how it navigated apartheid. It's a big part of our story, including some of the compromises and some of what today are euphemistically called missteps. Another focus was for its connection with the Natal Medical School and Christian-trained but politically liberal, later defiantly radical, ANC-aligned Black professionals. Finally, what stands out about McCord, which features in our epilogue, which will be the subject of the second book by and large, is that its brave treatment of HIV and AIDS patients in the face of government opposition in the early 20th century. It all makes a great story, one that we could, in conscience as academics, write for a non-academic readership, whilst being allowed to reflect on what are usually called its warts and all. It took a lot of effort to actually write in a non-academic way, but we're very happy with it's an open access book. Another thing that we grappled with as secular historians, it was a big challenge to think and write about what work religiosity and religion and faith did across more than a century of a hospital existence.
The history department at the University of Natal is legendary for its seminar culture and the Shark Tank. What do you remember of it in those days?
Oh, the Shark Tank. It was simultaneously exhilarating, terrifying, stimulating, rigorous, hard work, and at times fun. It was held every week of the academic year between 3 and 4:30 on a Wednesday afternoon. Full papers were uploaded in advance on the website or on Moodle, I can't remember now, and all members of staff and postgraduate students were expected to read critically and to ask relevant questions. People came from economic history, philosophy, anthropology, sociology, politics, and more, but historians were at the heart and at the core of it. As a presenter, you had 20 minutes to speak to, but not read the paper, and then face questions for over an hour. This made you defend your arguments, exposed you to their weaknesses very graphically, gave you advice, and was most often very helpful. Reading outside your own narrow area of expertise and formulating questions makes for engaged scholarship. My thinking about my own research changed a great deal, and was a lot better for those seminars. Your skin couldn't be too thin or your head too big, no matter what academic rank you held. But jazz, wine, pizza afterwards were often a balm to a few bruised egos. It was the most intellectually stimulating experience I've ever had. It was cumulatively beneficial. I wish it could be duplicated, replicated.
And then the big personalities. People often associate Jeff Guy with the department. What are your memories of him?
Big man, yeah. I first read Jeff's work on the ecological factors on the rise of the Zulu kingdom, I think in the late 1980s, as one of the readings for one of Ruth Edgecombe's courses in economic history. I first met him, though I'm sure he didn't notice me at all, at a workshop on the Pietermaritzburg campus, which must have been held shortly after his return to South Africa in 1992. He was then returning as head of the history department in Durban. He was tall. I am very short. He was intimidating and appeared constitutionally grumpy. He did not suffer those he considered fools. But he set about building a very dynamic department, first with Yona Selechi. He later went on to Campbell Collections. Catherine Burns, Keith Breckenridge, Mareka du Toit, and at that time a series of short-term appointments. And later the department grew to include Tembisa Wachan, Gulam Wahed, Kalpana Hirilal, and Vukile Kumalo. Jabulani Sitole was in Maritzburg, joined there by Vanessa Noble. Fluent in his Zulu, Jeff was dedicated to archival research. He navigated balancing Marxist-inspired materialist analysis with questions of power, gender, and biography. As a first-year lecturer, he is remembered as passionate, sweaty, an excellent teacher of regional histories, and he insisted on beginning the academic year by talking about Southern Africa, not South Africa, in terms of a tri-continental frontier of interactions across land and sea. Jeff was famous for his feuds, but to me, he was generous and encouraging. He shared archival sources with me and took my forays into the colonial archives seriously. He was formidably well informed about how those archives fitted together, knowledge which he shared with his postgraduate students, insisting that you read not just a document previously identified on the database of NAIRS, but around it, tracing the thread, finding the grain, and then reading against the grain. He was scathing in his views of the atrocities perpetrated in the name of British or any other civilization, so-called civilization. He was a magnificent orator. The preparation was extensive, painstaking, and nerve-wracking for him and the rest of us. He was a fierce debater on many things. He was very funny in a wicked way and absolutely committed to scholarship. He loved birds, and he was a menace behind the wheel.
Let's get into tribal talk about the history of the tribe. You were president of the Southern African Historical Society from 2009 to 11. And one thing I noted from reading John Wright's reflections on the 2009 conference at UNISA and yours of the 2011 Durban conference was that there seemed to be a dramatic uptick in the participation in the SAHS conference. It had become the Southern African Historical Society conference from 2005 at Cape Town, if I believe. But participation almost doubled by 2011. In his reflections, Wright spoke of a post-94 crisis in the discipline. And in your reflections, you portrayed a discipline that was not yet quite out of ICU. So what are your memories of that 94 to late 2000s, first decade of the 2000s crisis in inverted commas? And how, if at all, did it play out at UKZN?
Well, there seems to be a permanent sense that the historical profession is in crisis. I don't think that's entirely accurate, or at least I think that each generation experiences crises in different ways. Part of what the crisis John refers to in that review, post-1994, may have been the subdivision of history in new ways. The rise of rationalization and managerialism at UKZN, the intellectual upsets of postmodernism, but also, paradoxically, the opening up of international scholarship to more South Africans who traveled increasingly to international conferences and meetings and gave less support to local ones than they had in the past. Let's remember that the timing of the SAHS and the HASA conferences coincides with the European summer conference season. I think it's something we should think about looking at. But in fact, one sense of the crisis that John mentioned, falling student numbers, was not a feature of Durban, where the department, in association with Internet Studies, which was started by Keith Breckenridge, was blossoming in the late 1990s and the early 2000s. Actually, the SAHS meeting at UJ in 2007, convened by Natasha Erlank, was pretty energetic too. And at UCT in 2005, the Howard College contingent caused a bit of a stir for its youthful energy. Those then graduate students were the ones who actually encouraged me and Tembisa Wachin, who had by then joined the department, to go along with them to the conference. The UKZN students, graduates from the late 1990s into the 2000s include Pranisha Badasi, Andrew McDonald, Stephen Sparks, Nafisa Asif-Sheikh, Ian McQueen, Surya Kanti Chetty, Julian Brown, Mandisa Mbali, and more. And before them, as I mentioned, Vanessa Noble and Bugile Kamalo had got PhDs overseas and returned to posts at UKZN. There were jobs for many of that season of graduates, less so for the next generations of UKZN graduates. Nonetheless, there are many who hold high posts in government and heritage-related enterprises. But later graduates have found fewer openings in academia or government. And I think, again, this is an important factor when we debate representativity in the profession. The number of jobs has held steady or shrunk dramatically in some places. There are more people vying for a smaller number of jobs. But it was the earlier UKZN cohorts, along with Natasha Erlank at UJ, Tembisa Wachin, and Jane Carruthers at UNISA, who were responsible for revitalizing the SAHS by 2011. Jane was president 2009 to 2011, having been vice president, and she devoted enormous commitment to the society. At this stage, the SAHJ became a Taylor and Francis publication. It was Jane's idea to do that, and she organized that. It was her idea to establish a joint book prize with HASA. It was her idea to inaugurate a prize for the best student conference paper. She invited archivists to talk at the conference in 2009. But it was one of our graduate students, Felix Jackson, who mooted the idea of funky conference bags and danceable entertainment. July in Durban is a very desirable place to be. There were, I think, hundreds of delegates and papers. It buzzed. It was our then graduate students who saved the day when promised laptops and data projectors did not materialize the night before, and windows had not been cleaned, something which people don't know. It was Jacob Glamini who electrified the discussions. It was the archival platform who engaged in dialogue with state archivists and the Nelson Mandela Foundation. Collectively, we made conferencing cool again. It was great to be able to hand over to Axon Kanduza, then at the University of Botswana, who hosted the next conference in 2013, the first Southern African Historical Society to be held outside of South Africa. Yet in another sense, there was indeed a crisis. On the Maritzburg and Westville campuses of UKZN, history staffing numbers shrank drastically, disappearing altogether at the former UDW. Economic history disappeared in Pietermaritzburg. The numbers of staff in Maritzburg never recovered, there being only 2 full-time members of staff there by the time I returned in 2012, briefly. Even on the Howard College campus, we were always under great pressure to attract more and more students. Every module and staff position had to be defended, struggled over. There was a lot of administrative upheaval caused in part by the merger with UDW and so-called rationalization. History curricula were required to be standardized across both Howard College and Pietermaritzburg. Same curriculum taught on 2 different campuses, at least at first year level. Specialization, expertise was no longer as valued by administration. In fact, it was actively discouraged as far as teaching went. History was no longer a matric teaching subject, I think after 2005, so fewer students took history as a career choice. These were beginning to be very difficult years at UKZN. By the late 2000s, student protests against fee exclusion and other issues, especially at the beginning of the academic year, were the norm. Management became more hierarchical, distant from academic scholarly input, and academic headship no longer had the sense of being about knowledge or teaching related. Instead, it was a rotating administrative burden. Across the last 4 or 5 of my last years on the UKZN academic staff, student protests became increasingly destructive of property, and intimidation of non-striking students and some staff happened. Gender-based violence occurred, not unfrequently. We had to lock the gates to our corridor. Campus was becoming securitized. There was a hostile crackdown on academic freedom of staff who were regarded as criticizing management and policies. Classes got ever bigger, and our ability to decide on the skills level needed for admission to postgraduate students taken away from us. Performance assessment based on so-called throughput and student numbers bore little or no relationship to what we regarded as being academically valuable. Traditionally exacting reading and writing requirements were disparaged by administration. Absurd formulae were applied to performance assessment. Staff members who had been lecturing for years were required to get an extra qualification in teaching. Between 2009 and 2012 or so, 6 members of the Howard College History Department left. I resigned from the University of KwaZulu-Natal at the end of 2013. I remained an honorary research affiliate for the next 8 years, I think, which enabled me to retain online access to the library and to carry on researching. But I've not had any contact with my alma mater for some years now.
And then, Julie, among your other professional positions has been as acting chairperson of the National Archives Advisory Council and also an advisor for the Alan Paton Archives in Pietermaritzburg. How would you characterize the state of the archives in post-apartheid South Africa and the key challenges facing that sector?
Unfortunately, I've not been able to visit an archive in person for some years now, so I'm going to restrict my comments to the time period in which I was active. As you will know, the National Archives Advisory Council has had a bumpy past. I was nominated, I think, jointly by HASA and the SAHS. I stand to be corrected there. And I was appointed in 2012. I arrived at my first meeting in February 2013, unprepared but willing to learn. I did learn a great deal during the time I served on the Advisory Council, and at its best, it was very instructive about the logistical, material, and conceptual challenges of taking a colonial and apartheid-era institution turning it into a democratic service. Think of the practicalities of restructuring from 4 to 9 provinces, with the undertaking to provide archives physically close to the people who needed access to them. How, for example, do you decide which documents or collections to move from Cape Town to Kimberley? But the council was already a diminished institution. It had been downgraded from a commission, which under the 1996 National Archives of South Africa Act, as Vern Harris has explained, was intended to have watchdog and public accountability capacities, with critical executive powers in addition to a medley of advisory ones. I'm quoting Vern Harris. But the commission lacked a substantial budget or administrative support. In 2001, the Act was amended by the Cultural Laws Amendment Act, and the commission replaced by an advisory council. It had no executive powers. Each province had representation, but this was lengthy and costly to achieve. What Harris describes as a smaller watchdog commission was succeeded by a larger talk shop council. There was no political will for it to succeed. It did not meet at all between 2007 and 2013. This continued during my time on the council. It was a talk shop without a mandate and without support. When I was appointed in 2012, civil society, the archival platform, a project spearheaded by Carolyn Hamilton, the NRF chair in Archive and Public Culture, and the Nelson Mandela Foundation, had been for quite some time trying to engage in a constructive way to build a network between the public, the professions, archivists, researchers, historians, and government. They launched several campaigns, such as the Letters to Lulu campaign, to try to alert the minister and department to the need for better communication and services. They also produced a very important State of the Archives report, which they presented in Parliament. It's available online. It's essential reading. As a council, we were only inaugurated a year after we'd been appointed, for 3 years. While some members of the council were concerned only with high-profile political records, others of us had different concerns. Some of the issues we tried to formulate documents around for the minister's attention included the opening of records under the 20-year rule, which would have covered 1994, the need for support for endangered collections in places such as police stations and cemeteries, a more assured career path for young archivists, preservation and access to records that had medical information, thinking about those ahead of the protection of privacy laws, the upgrading of the online database, and many other issues. We also discussed at length the move of the archives and records services from a flabby ministry that amalgamated sports, arts, and culture to that, say, of justice or an independent body. This is because the National Archives is also responsible for records management of relevant government bodies. That some elements of government resisted this soon became clear. One archivist reported harrowing stories of being intimidated and threatened after being denied access to sets of documents to do with government tenders. Others sat in new buildings without any records. All records management offices were understaffed. According to the Act, Council was to submit to the Minister and to Parliament an annual report. But these reports had been absorbed into a glossy but meaningless broader departmental report with no direct input by the Council. It soon became clear that the Council could not function successfully. While there was a lot of goodwill and commitment by some, I also saw gross unprofessional conduct, absenteeism to the extent that the Council could not function, indifference, and personal and political agendas and hostility. Ministers either ignored our memoranda or claimed not to have received them. Our term of office did not coincide with the actual inauguration of the Council, as already mentioned, and applications to have this aligned were again ignored or blocked. By the time the appointment had expired in 2015, it was clear to me that it had been a particularly unedifying and distasteful exercise in futility. I had not yet heard the term state capture. There have been a couple of councils since 2015. There's little publicly available information about what issues they've been concerned with or whether they've had any success in advising subsequent ministers. The last short report that I could see on the National Archives website about the activities of the Council is dated February 2015. Similarly outdated is the publicly available substantial information on the Alan Paton Centre and Struggle Archives in Pietermaritzburg, which gradually lost its independent identity after being subsumed under UKZN's library services. There were concerns about the safety of some of its collections during unrest on campus a while back, but I believe everything was okay. Its staffing is woefully reduced, but the single person who's currently in charge is keeping it going. It is a wonderful archive. My last official contact with them was some years ago. The last time I was able to work in an archive, an actual public archive, was in Pretoria. I think it was 2016 or 2017. The desk staff were young, enthusiastic, but completely undertrained. Finding aids were in tatters. There was no available expertise, as I had been enormously fortunate to experience in Pietermaritzburg and Cape Town. Health problems hit me in 2019 and have since restricted my ability to travel. But friends have helped at Cape and Gauteng archives, and for some years I have employed a part-time local research assistant. And she gives me good reports of the continued dedicated and helpful staff at the Pietermaritzburg Archives collections and at the nationally important Bessie Head Repository Library here in Pietermaritzburg.
Your departure from UKZN, you subsequently worked, I understand, in Gauteng universities. Can you tell us a bit about what that involved in terms of a life change for you?
Okay. As I mentioned, I was an honorary professor at UKZN for 6 to 8 years. Then I was appointed research associate at the University of Pretoria, which is my current affiliation. I still live in Pietermaritzburg. I no longer teach or supervise students, and my only employer is myself. That has both its upsides and its downsides. Office politics are easier. We do whatever the cat tells us to do. Health challenges, COVID and load shedding notwithstanding, I have been able to be fairly productive. From 2014, I had a couple of small grants from the NRF and the Wellcome Trust and worked in a couple of new directions. I had the enormous privilege of thinking through ideas and finding sources and beginning new projects with Tembisa Wetjen, now of UJ. In fact, I've always been fortunate to collaborate with some other scholars, remarkable historians, anthropologists, and a medical museum specialist. In 2012, 2013, I was persuaded to do research into a topic I thought I had no interest in, and in fact that there was no history to be researched, that of thalidomide in South Africa. There followed first a collaboration with Canadian historian Susan Claassen into the impact of the thalidomide scandal of the early 1960s on medicines regulation in South Africa, and the changes in abortion laws here in the early 1970s as a result of thalidomide scare. We published that research in SAHS in 2015. The Medicines Control Council, now the South African Health Products Regulatory Authority, was established in 1965. Its architect was a now forgotten but then important figure, formerly personal physician to Jan Smuts in his later years, decorated for service during the Second World War, and professor of medicine at Wits 1946 to 1967. His name was Guy Abercrombie Elliott. Some of his papers are at the Adler Museum at Wits, and reading them, my interest was sparked by some correspondence between him and a colleague about a doctor being tried for the murder of his own father. Elliott had taught the doctor at Wits. The doctor's name was Dr. Albie Hartman. Hartman's defense was that he had been motivated by compassion. More about that in a minute. I wasn't researching him at that stage. Instead, in the wider world around me, in 2012, was a major court case in Australia brought by thalidomide survivors in that country against the German manufacturers of the drug thalidomide and a multinational company that had decades previously taken over the British distributors of thalidomide in Australia. Records became available on the internet, which recorded conclusive proof of exports of thalidomide to South Africa. I was aware of people I'd been at school with who'd been told that their disabilities were caused by thalidomide, but had never been able to prove it. They began an archival hunt for thalidomide distributed here in the late 1950s or early 1960s. I teamed up with German historian Ludger Wimmelbucher, who is researching a global history of the drug across more than 50 countries. We published our findings in the journal Social History of Medicine online in 2019. The article covered the drug's exports to Namibia, Zimbabwe, South Africa, Mozambique, and Angola. It's a good example of regional research that doesn't fit the usual political history mode. We drew heavily on political economy and late colonial circuits of capital, as well as histories of pharmaceuticals and medicine and health, to explain why there were so few children born in this region affected by the drug, despite massive sales of the drug, of the medicines containing the drug in some countries. In the way of these things, it may have moved the needle a fraction in the history of medicine, but it doesn't seem to be seen as relevant in South Africa. Nor did it lead, sadly, to conclusive proof of thalidomides having damaged any pregnant women and their children in this country. For several years, I was in an informal partnership with Tembisa in researching drug histories, broadly defined. She has brought out a brilliant suite of articles on histories of addiction and the state's attempts to regulate and police narcotic drugs. Tembisa organized a series of excellent workshops at UJ, and one, if not two, was held at Pharmacy House, the museum in Johannesburg, which you should visit if you can. Together with Rebecca Hoddes, also now of UP, we co-authored an article on drugs and pharmaceutical histories of South Africa, which was published in the International Journal Medical Humanities in 2018, a special edition of the SAHJ in 2019. I published an article on the surprising history of sedatives and tranquilizers in South Africa, also in 2019. So my collaboration with colleagues in Gauteng has been unofficial, but close. Also in 2019, it was a busy year, I accepted the invitation from Karen Harris at UP to become editor-in-chief of Historia, and it made sense for me to take up the affiliation as research associate there rather than renew for another term at UKZN.
And then precisely on that point, as editor of Historia, what are your recollections as editor, and how would you estimate the journal's significance within the field?
Okay, well, as you know, until about 15 years ago, the SAHJ was published by UNISA Press on behalf of the South African, as it was then, Southern African Historical Society. It is now in the Taylor and Francis stable of academic publications and has gone from strength to strength. It is financially well-resourced, fairly financially well-resourced, with copy editing and layout and so on, the responsibility of the publisher. There is no doubt that it is the prestige historical journal published, which is anchored in this region. After an initial period of absorption of costs, though, the SAHJ's intent on behalf of the publishers is to earn profit. While there are various access options available, without significant financial resources at you or your institution's disposal, not all articles are equally available to readers, at least not initially. Historia remains run by the Historical Association of South Africa and now follows open access model of publishing with no page fees charged to individual authors. Only nominal fees are charged to their institutions. This places the journal at a disadvantage because at the moment it's only possible to charge these fees to South African-based authors. As at the SAHJ, considerable work is carried out by the editorial team, especially the editor-in-chief. It is unpaid and often undervalued by employers. Historia earns no profit for anyone. Arguably, its ethos is closer to that of the intellectual commons than the for-profit model. Its standing as a journal oriented to the region, published in Southern Africa, edited within the region, and financed in the region is solid. Not flashy, not sexy, but I tried to build on excellent work of previous editors in establishing a reasonably quick turnaround period, personalized contact with both authors and reviewers, a hands-on decision-making role for the editor, something I have not always experienced myself as an author, and a predictable publishing schedule. Whether it can be sustained, I do not know, as there is a palpable crisis in academic publishing generally. But I believe there is space for both models of publishing in South Africa. Everywhere, editors are multitasking, are overworked or perfunctory. That's been my experience, particularly with international journals, and reviewers are hard to find. I was fortunate to be able to dedicate a lot of time to assisting authors with their writing. That's not something every editor can do. It was one of my tasks to build up a younger and more diverse editorial team. This I did. Even so, after 4 intense years, I felt a sense akin to what in medicine they call moral injury or moral harm. This is witnessing repeatedly wrong, unjust, or harmful acts by dint of reading in close detail, repeatedly, hundreds of articles and reviews about injustice, oppression, and harms. History isn't for sissies, but I think that we should recognize that editors and reviewers absorb a great deal of this moral harm, and that we should receive the support and recognition from peers, of course, as well as from employers.
You spoke earlier in one of your previous answers about the historians always feeling as though they're in a state of crisis. So if it's always crisis, I guess it's never crisis. But how would you characterize the state of the discipline today? How are we doing comparatively to the past? And how would you, well, if I were to give you a blank canvas on which to paint your ideas, what would you say about the state of historiography in Southern Africa today?
I'm going to resist the word crisis.
Good.
If we are speaking of South Africa, I'd say contradictory and patchy. There are some dynamic, vibrant pockets of energy and growth, including in previously somewhat unpromising places, such as at the University of the Free State, the University of Pretoria. It doesn't quite fit in as an unpromising place at all, but I'm seeing wonderful expansion there. AMAFA, an initiative of the KZN Heritage Department, is hosting a webinar series in the absence and the collapse, to my knowledge anyway, I stand to be corrected, of anything coming out of UKZN. The biennial conferences of the SAHJ and HASA are well subscribed from what I hear. We have some excellent scholars. I know that my best feedback as an author comes from when I publish locally. Yet at the universities, proportionate to the huge numbers of students, numbers of professional historians have stagnated at best. In some places, they've plummeted. In some places, ideological pressures are brought to bear on staff. There is much talk of failures to decolonize the discipline. Yet I don't think sufficient attention has been paid to some of the scholarship and the teaching initiatives which have been trying to do this for a long time. Fees Must Fall gets a lot of attention. Both students' fees protests and decentering Eurocentrism have been a feature of some universities for a very long time. I don't think we've factored in, as I mentioned earlier, how AIDS, gender-based violence, perhaps COVID, and the international academic economy, what they mean for staffing or students. Students seem even less prepared to read and write than ever before. Postgraduate degrees are subjected to unrealistic timeframes, and the problems posed to both teaching and scholarship itself by AI are only just beginning to be comprehended. This is where I would like to see a much more active role of the societies, getting our heads together to talk about how historians can think through solutions as opposed to piecemeal responses. Also, as opposed to workshops that happen overseas. I think we need to talk about our students here, talk about them here. I think we also carry something of a dual personality, sometimes valuing international publishing and recognition more than our own. I hope that the recently inaugurated SAHS HASA annual Best Book Prize is going to have a positive impact here.
Well, speaking of books, if you could say, what are your 3 favorite history books?
This was a tough one. This was a very tough one. I thought about it a lot. And it depends on the time of day and the mood. But as of yesterday, my 3 favorite history books, the first is a novel. It's a detective novel, published in 1951, The Daughter of Time, authored by Josephine Tay. I read it as a teenager. It is in a way that's become somewhat eerily reminiscent of my own life. It is a police detective who has a broken leg and who is confined to bed. And as an intellectual puzzle, he sets out from reading materials brought to him to solve the mystery of who killed the princes in the Tower of London, and whether it was the King Richard III who was guilty or not. The Daughter of Time's drawn from a quotation from Shakespeare. It's actually Truth is the Daughter of Time, and it's about sources, bias, prejudice, lies, and murder. The second one is a compendium published, I think, in 1998. It's called Why History Matters, Life and Thought, published in 1998. The life and the thought of the historian Gerda Lerner, who lived between 1920 and 2013. If one doesn't know the story of Gerda Lerner, she grew up in Austria speaking German. She escaped the Nazis, moved to America, had to learn to think and to write in English. And this is a series of essays about histories that are forgotten, histories that are challenging, language that we think and dream in, and a review of her work after she died called her a master interpreter of the interrelatedness of various forms of domination. Today, many academic feminists call this understanding intersectionality. So, although she didn't coin the term intersectionality, she was a theorizer of intersectionality in the 1980s and 1990s. My third and final one is a book that I confess I wish I'd written, because it is short, crisp, and beautifully written, unlike my long and full of detail material. It is Howard Phillips's 2012 Jacana Pocket History of Epidemics in South Africa, Pox, Plague, and Pandemics. And it covers from the 18th century through to the 20th century in 5 chapters and an introduction and a conclusion in, I don't know, can't reach for the book right now, 100-something pages. And he looks at smallpox, plague, Spanish flu, polio, HIV, and AIDS. And I'm quite sure out there somewhere there's a follow-up chapter on COVID. I wish I had written that one. Those are my 3 for today.
And then, Julie, what are you working on at the moment?
Whew. Well, 2022, I published a very long, very detailed, complicated article on the Hartman trial that I mentioned earlier in the SAHJ. I'm very grateful to have been given the word limit and the space to go into such detail about it. It's really, that was a history of debates about what is colloquially called euthanasia in South Africa between the 1930s and 1975, 1976. The trial was in 1975. I take it up to 76 when the apartheid state intervened and ordered that Dr. Hartman be struck off the medical register, even though the medical fraternity had welcomed him, even though he'd been found guilty of murder. They welcomed him back into the profession, but the apartheid state insisted that he be struck off the register. And I speculate as to why that might have been and what the implications some of that might have been for the history of medical, the autonomy of medical bodies in South Africa. As we know, most notorious came to light with the murder of, the lack of response to the murder of Steve Biko. My most recent research has extended the debate about euthanasia into beyond 1976 to between 1974 to 1994. And I have an article coming out, please, sometime soon, in the Southern Journal for Contemporary History, which looks at the efforts to get a living will recognized in law and passive euthanasia recognized in law. Passive euthanasia meaning effectively you can take people off life support without the doctor being open to prosecution for murder. A living will is something that you're probably familiar with. It's in common parlance, but they're not actually legally enforceable. And the reason for that is going to be part of what I'm researching at the moment, which is a pivotal period in the 1990s when South Africa had a major commission into end-of-life decisions and what it called euthanasia. It's now called physician-assisted dying. And had the recommendations of that commission been accepted, South Africa would have been amongst the first countries in the world, along with a very interesting suite of other countries, including Colombia, to legalize assisted dying. You may know that the British Parliament has just assented to a bill to recognize assisted dying. The French Parliament did recently, and so on. But in 1997, 98, had we accepted the recommendations of that commission, we would have been amongst the first countries to do so. The reasons for that and the reasons why that was rejected is what I intend to write on next. And finally, if it doesn't finish me off, I want to go back in time. I want to go back to the colonial period. And I want to look at why in the international literature and the tiny amount of local literature, it claims that euthanasia is not practiced in Southern Africa by African peoples. But yet it's one of the first things that explorers and colonists noted did occur. So I think that will take me up to time for gin and tonic.
Oh, Julie, it's such a pleasure. Is it okay if I asked you a few burning questions that came to mind while you were speaking?
As long as I don't have to contact my lawyers, yes.
Well, it's just that you are one of the most humane historians I've ever come across. And we spoke about it at the beginning in terms of how you were affected by thalidomide. And I've had conversations with people in different contexts who, live with some form of a disability. And what I find fascinating is just how that just shapes your worldview in a sense that you look at things from other angles that people don't normally just take, that can't be taken for granted. So I do wonder, have you thought, do you think that it shaped your approach, as a person, but also as a historian, because you as a person are a historian. Do you think it's given you, I don't know, other perspectives that are otherwise ignored?
I could joke about the view from the social history movement talks about the view from below.
You have it literally.
I have it literally. I'm only 4 foot tall. But Lindie, I was asked this question a couple of years ago in Canada, and I was giving a paper there, and I was not ready to answer it then. I did not feel comfortable. I have spent my whole life, as I mentioned at the beginning, trying not to be that person, trying not to be disabled. Of course I am disabled, but I wanted to live a life that was not defined by that. And all of those years that we spoke about what was happening on campus and political activism and so on, I was never directly involved. I couldn't be, and I didn't find it intellectually, not intellectually, that's the wrong word. I just could not find a niche to be involved. But what I did do is I spent a long period of time as a telephone counselor for Lifeline. And I, believe it or not, my husband probably wouldn't agree with you, I learned how to listen. And I was exposed to the fact that everybody in their lives has complications, sadness, trauma, compromises, illness, violence, and so on, and so on, and so on. But I could be a voice. Nobody could see me. And so I didn't have to get over their expectations of who I was. And I found that, I think it was about 10 years that I was a counselor for Lifeline, shaped me in ways that have made me sensitive to the kinds of sources I look for, and paying attention to, interesting in the Hartman trial, silences, what is not said, what is not recorded, what is taboo. So I could not own my own identity as a disabled person. I have hardly any disabled friends. I did not, I was shunned by the very patriarchal Cripple Care, it was called, Cripple Care Society in Pietermaritzburg, when I tried to join in the 1990s. And then I withdrew, and I decided to focus my energies on elsewhere. So I guess in some ways, I may have been something of a role model, but to regret now, I did not consciously seek out other disabled people or ally with them. Recently, I read an obituary of a disability activist at UCT called Kathy Jago, who I wish I had met, because apparently she wrote about how she drew inspiration from Black consciousness and Steve Biko as a disabled activist. And I would like somebody to write a good history of Kathy Jago and those kinds of thinking. I'm not sure that I've answered your question. It's difficult to do.
I just think what I hear from you and what I heard as you described your work is just how incredibly multi-layered it all is. And you've lived a very multi-layered life. That's the story that's coming to me. But also just in all these layers, apart from that, what I find fascinating is you stand out as someone who collaborates so well. Because if I think about it very carefully, I don't know many historians in our circles in South Africa who collaborate as extensively as you do. I think that actually singles you out as having, I don't know, very, very special abilities, I suppose, in working with others and being very fruitful. So maybe a collaboration comes naturally to you, but for the rest of us, who are mostly lone wolf researchers, I'm actually interested. What is the secret sauce?
Wine. I'm a naturally inquisitive and talkative person. I have lots of ideas. I'm always interested in what people are researching. One of the tricks that we were taught to think about as honors students was to think about counterfactuals. I don't know if you still teach about counterfactuals. I'm always thinking of counterfactuals. What if not? Collaboration can be very rewarding. It has been a necessity in my case. So I can't physically go to some places. But it's also a basis on which meaningful and long-time friendships have developed. I'm very talkative, as you've probably gathered. I think that I look back now, some of the collaborations, people may have been carried away by my enthusiasm, and some of the sources we may look at differently now at a different stage of our life. I think something that what we don't talk about a lot is aging, and what historians do when they age. Can you turn off the tap of interest? Should you? Should you withdraw? When should you stop? When should you carry on? Those are all things I'm struggling with at the moment. What I would love to do is collaborate with interesting people who I'm reading, not in history, but in philosophy and English literature, and regrettably, I'm not fluent in any other language, to talk about a true African history of aging and dying. We've skirted around it with AIDS. There's some anthropological stuff, which is really nice, but I would like to collaborate with people like that. But it's a bit difficult. But we'll see. We'll see what happens.
I think when you mentioned Howard Phillips, I agree. That pox, plagues, and pandemics. It's one of the best works of history I have read, but also it gave me a completely different lens of looking at history and looking at South Africa. And in a sense, I suppose what you medical historians do to the rest of us is you force us to consider that we all have bodies, I suppose, that bodies have become something of a buzzword in later years. Somehow we just, I don't know, we don't think of bodies in history unless they're being killed on the battlefield otherwise.
I detest the term, the Freudian-inspired term, the disabled body, or the African body, or the female body. We are not just bodies. We are minds, we are hearts, we are soul. Some of us have souls. I'm not sure I don't have a soul in a religious sense, but that is only reinforcing the gaze of the powerful. And I think my work has always been about insisting on the individuality. And also Foucault is of very little use to you if you or your child is ever in a medical encounter of your own.
Yes, when you and a child are in medical encounters, actually you see power relations at play from a very interesting angle. But that also, the other part that fascinates me about your work is just, I like the fact that you question terminologies because they make me uncomfortable as well. And I think of this whole idea of, okay, let me throw the terminologies out there. The ideas of micro-histories or local histories and local and global, which have also become buzzwords. But as I listen to your accounts of the work you've done, I find it fascinating again how you use this lens just to tell a much bigger story, but also again to bring in new angles. And then again, comparing that to Howard Phillips and seeing how, the medical historians force us to think differently.
I don't think that the medical history, or most histories, fit neatly in the radical liberal binary. And I don't think they have for a long time. And sexuality and disability, all of these need to be kept in play. But I read an article, the title of which escapes me at the moment, in the 1990s by feminist Susan Bordeaux, which says there is no view from nowhere. We are all situated, and I didn't choose what did Marx say? Make life, but not in circumstances of our own choosing. I haven't chosen large aspects of my life, but I would, if I had to do it all over again, I wouldn't be anything other than a historian. I think it's the best profession in the world, and most important.
So, actually, that's actually a question. I like that phrasing. I will admit, I mean, on the one hand, positionality is so incredibly important, and yet on the other hand, I find it so limiting, and it could so easily become a label. I actually like Heidegger's idea of we have been thrown into the world. But my question in that regard is also, are we, again, we do occupy positions. It's impossible not to. They do play in. But yet I keep thinking that the human mind is capable of wider imagination. And that's what we as historians do all the time. We keep imagining ourselves in different worlds.
Absolutely. And empathy. And not writing history backwards. Not expecting people that we write about to be the wizard Merlin, living time backwards, knowing what comes next. That takes a lot of work, a lot of self-discipline to try to balance what did come next and what the outcomes were, and what your actors knew at the time. And you can't, I strongly believe you can only learn that through reading and writing. Perhaps I'm wrong. Perhaps you can learn it on TikTok, but I would doubt it.
And if I could ask you this, I don't know, sometimes when you are busy doing your work, you get that sweet spot. This is my happy place. This is why I like history. What is your sweet spot, happy place when writing history?
I was just telling Thula earlier that I tell my husband every time I write something, this is the hardest thing I've ever had to write. I can't do this. It's not coming. And I write and I rewrite and I rewrite. And he'll call me for lunch or dinner or what have you. And I say I'll be there in 5 minutes. And half an hour or even an hour can go by. I'm in a different world. And when I'm writing and it's flowing well, I am extremely, extremely happy and rewarded. When I'm not writing, I'm thinking about writing. So it's an art and a craft and a discipline. And sometimes I get it right. That's all I can say.
And in terms of writing also, I love the fact that you have a historical novel at the top of your list. Because I'm also a very big fan of historical novels, and yours is now on the top of my reading list. And there's that relation between, I mean, there's the creative side of writing, creative side of being a historian, and yet also being limited by your sources. But do you think historians have more to learn from fiction and historical fiction? I'm not talking all Hayden White now, just in terms of the books we read.
Yes, I haven't been reading novels for a while. And I think that shows in my writing. It's becoming more ploddy. So I need to take some time out and read some and learn to pay attention to how successful writers write. It's something I'm not very good at. I can disappear into a novel, but I would like to go on a course that would teach me how to write more novelistically. One of the options I could have with stuff that I'm doing now is to, in fact, try to write a book rather than a series of articles. But I'm very daunted by trying to take on such a big topic which I'm still working through article by article. I'm still doing the scaffolding work. And that's very important that historians do scaffolding work, dates and times and people. You know, I'm working in a vacuum as far as this topic goes. So I would like to write like, I think the trick is to work so damn hard it makes it look like you haven't tried at all.
I think that's the art of good writing. I will say, though, I did one of those courses. It convinced me that I shall never, ever, ever write fiction because I'm good at describing a story, but coming up with it myself, no, thank you very much. But I think what one quickly learns are the principles of storytelling. You know, characters people can relate to, the humaneness, not using too many, no, actually not being too wordy. You know, so those are basic principles. Thank you, Julie.
Thanks a lot, Julie. Thanks very much for your time.
I hope it was informative and interesting for you both.
Certainly was that, yes.
No,
Thank
this
you very
was
much for your time.
fantastic.
Okay,
Thank you,
take care,
Julie.
both
Thank
of
you
you.
so much.